The morning sun beat down on Officer Steve Roberts as he received the call over his radio. Another disturbance in the predominantly black neighborhood of East Side. His jaw clenched automatically. These calls always put him on edge. 15 years on the force had left him with deeply ingrained prejudices he refused to acknowledge. 10-4, responding to suspicious activity on Mason Street, Steve spoke into his radio, already steering his patrol car toward the location. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel with barely contained agitation. 3 complaints about his aggressive behavior sat unaddressed on his captain's desk, but Steve didn't care. In his mind, he was just doing his job. The streets were busy that morning, with children walking to school and adults heading to work. Steve's eyes darted from person to person, his suspicion growing with each passing block. He'd always viewed this neighborhood as hostile territory rather than a community he was sworn to protect. As he turned onto Mason Street, he spotted an elderly black woman helping a young boy cross the road. Rosa Williams, though Steve didn't know her name yet, wore a simple floral dress and carried a worn leather handbag. She moved slowly, one hand gripping a wooden cane, the other holding the child's small hand. Steve's radio crackled with an update: suspect described as female, elderly, possibly armed, last seen near Mason and 4th. The description was vague enough to fit dozens of people, but Steve's attention locked onto Rosa. His training should have told him to observe first, but his prejudices took control. He slammed his car into park and jumped out, hand already resting on his weapon. Police. Don't move, he shouted, causing several pedestrians to freeze in place. Rosa turned slowly, confusion evident on her face. Officer, I'm just helping this child, she began, her voice calm and dignified. But Steve wasn't listening. In his mind, the hand in her bag could be reaching for a weapon. The years of unchecked aggression and racial bias exploded in an instant. He charged forward, grabbed Rosa's arm roughly, and shoved her against a nearby wall. The child screamed and ran away as Rosa's cane clattered to the ground. I said don't move. Steve barked, pressing her harder against the brick wall. Rosa gasped in pain but remained remarkably composed. Officer, I am a federal, Rosa tried again, but Steve cut her off with another rough shove. Shut up. You matched the description of a suspect. Stop resisting. By now, a crowd had gathered. Phones appeared from pockets and purses, recording everything. Voices rose in anger and disbelief as they watched a uniformed officer manhandling an elderly woman. She's not resisting, someone shouted. That's Ms. Rosa. She volunteers at the community center. Someone call 911. The situation spiraled quickly. More patrol cars arrived, lights flashing. Steve's partners rushed forward, not to help him, but to pull him away from Rosa. She slumped against the wall, dignity intact despite her disheveled appearance. Officer Jenkins, Steve's partner, grabbed his arm. Steve, stand down. What the hell are you doing? But Steve was too far gone in his rage to listen. He struggled against his colleagues, shouting about suspicious behavior and resisting arrest. The crowd's phones captured every second of his meltdown, every moment of his unwarranted aggression against an innocent elderly woman. What Steve didn't know, what would soon shatter his world, was that Rosa Williams was not just any elderly community member. She was an undercover federal agent investigating police misconduct. His actions that morning would trigger a cascade of events that would expose not just his own prejudices, but a deeper rot within the department itself. The police station erupted into chaos as 2 officers dragged Steve into the break room. His face was red with anger, his uniform disheveled from struggling against his own colleagues. Officer Jenkins blocked the door while Captain Morris rushed in, his expression a mix of fury and disbelief. What were you thinking, Roberts? The captain demanded, slamming his hand on the table. We've got dozens of videos already circulating online. The woman you assaulted is in the hospital getting checked out. Steve paced the room like a caged animal. She matched the description. She was reaching into her bag. I was following protocol. Protocol? Jenkins interrupted. Since when does protocol involve assaulting an elderly woman in broad daylight? She was helping a kid cross the street, for God's sake. Across town, in the Roberts household, Laura Roberts sat frozen on her couch, her phone displaying one of the viral videos of her husband's actions. Her hands shook as she watched Steve violently push the elderly woman against the wall. The comments under the video were brutal, calling for Steve's badge, his arrest, his imprisonment. Their 16-year-old daughter, Emily, walked in from school and found her mother crying. "Mom. What's wrong?" Laura couldn't speak, just handed her phone to Emily. As her daughter watched, Laura saw the moment Emily's world shifted, the moment she realized her father wasn't the hero she'd always believed him to be. Meanwhile, at the East Side Community Center, an emergency meeting was already in progress. Aisha Johnson, a 28-year-old community organizer, stood before a packed room of angry residents. The projector behind her showed frozen images from the morning's incident. "This isn't just about today," Aisha declared, her voice steady despite her anger. "This is about every time we've been profiled, every time we've been harassed, every time we've been told to just comply and everything will be fine." Ms. Rosa could have been anyone's grandmother. The crowd murmured in agreement. Among them sat Thomas Williams, Rosa's nephew and a civil rights attorney, furiously taking notes. His aunt's true identity as a federal agent was still under wraps, but he knew this incident would be the key to exposing years of systematic abuse. Back at the station, internal affairs investigators had arrived. They pulled Steve into an interview room, but he remained defiant. "Check my record," he insisted. "I've made more arrests in that neighborhood than any other officer. I know how they operate." "That's exactly the problem," the IA investigator replied coldly. "We have checked your record. 3 pending complaints of excessive force, all against minorities. Care to explain that pattern?" In the hospital, Rosa sat calmly as doctors documented her injuries. Though her ribs were bruised and her shoulder sprained, she maintained her cover perfectly. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from her federal superiors. This incident, while painful, had given them exactly the evidence they needed. Laura Roberts made a decision that evening. As she watched the protests growing outside the police station on the news, she pulled out her laptop and began searching through Steve's old case files that he kept in their home office. Years of marriage had taught her to ignore the signs, to make excuses for his behavior. But watching him assault an elderly woman had broken something in her. She needed to know the truth about the men she had married. The day ended with the city on edge. Protest organizers obtained permits for the following day. News vans lined the streets around the police station. Social media exploded with hashtags demanding justice for Rosa Williams. And in a secure federal office, a team of agents began compiling years of evidence, knowing that Steve Roberts had just given them the perfect catalyst for exposing the department's deep-rooted problems. Rosa Williams sat in her modest apartment, surrounded by files and photographs spread across her dining room table. Her bruised ribs ached as she reached for another document, but she ignored the pain. After 5 years of undercover work investigating police corruption, today's incident had finally blown her cover, but it had also given her the smoking gun she needed. Her secure phone buzzed with a message from her handler at the FBI. Green light for full disclosure. Operation details remain classified. Proceed with personal testimony only. Rosa began organizing her evidence methodically. Videos from previous incidents, witness statements collected over years, internal documents leaked by concerned officers, all pointing to a pattern of abuse that went far beyond Steve Roberts. Her hand trembled slightly as she touched her bruised shoulder, but her voice was steady as she dictated into her recorder. Federal Agent Rosa Williams, badge number 8742. Previous incidents suggest Officer Roberts' actions today were not isolated but part of a department-wide culture of racism and excessive force. Across town, Laura Roberts was conducting her own investigation. After putting their teenage daughter to bed, she slipped into Steve's home office. Years of looking the other way, of believing Steve's excuses, had left her with a sick feeling in her stomach. She began with his computer, finding emails between Steve and other officers discussing ways to handle complaints from minority residents. Her hands froze over the keyboard when she found a folder labeled Internal Reviews. Inside were dozens of body cam videos Steve had downloaded, all showing questionable arrests, all involving minority citizens. Laura copied everything to a USB drive, her legal training telling her this could be crucial evidence. At the station, Captain Morris faced his own crisis. The journalist who had been investigating the department for months, Michael Chen, sat across from his desk with a thick folder of documents. Want to explain why complaints against Officer Roberts were repeatedly buried? Chen asked, sliding forward a stack of internal memos. Or why officers who reported his behavior were transferred to desk duty? Morris's face remained stoic, but sweat beaded on his forehead. Those transfers were routine departmental procedures. All 7 of them. In the past 3 years. Chen pressed. And I suppose it's also routine that every officer who filed a complaint against Roberts or his friends suddenly received poor performance reviews. Meanwhile, in a small office at the Justice Department, Agent Sarah Martinez reviewed Rosa's years of undercover reports. The pattern was clear: Steve Roberts wasn't just a bad officer, he was a symptom of a larger disease. The department had systematically protected violent officers while punishing those who tried to speak up. Rosa's phone rang. It was Thomas, her nephew and attorney. "Aunt Rosa, I've been talking to other victims. 3 more families have come forward with videos. And an officer named Jenkins wants to talk, says he has proof the captain knew about Robert's behavior for years." Rosa nodded, adding these new details to her notes. "Tell Jenkins to document everything. And Thomas, be careful. The captain has friends in high places." In his holding cell, Steve paced anxiously. His union lawyer had advised him to keep quiet, but he could feel his world crumbling. Through the small window, he could see protesters gathering outside the station. Their signs bore Rosa's photo and demanded justice. Laura's investigation led her to a late-night meeting with Officer Jenkins in a quiet diner. His hands shook as he passed her a manila envelope. "It's all here," he whispered. "Dates, times, names. Every incident the captain covered up. Every officer who was silenced. But if they find out I gave you this..." Laura reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "They won't. This ends now." The community center's parking lot overflowed as hundreds gathered for the candlelight vigil. Rosa Williams sat in the front row, her presence both fragile and powerful. Despite her injuries, she had insisted on attending. The sea of candles flickered in the evening air as Aisha Johnson took the podium. "Look around you," Aisha's voice carried across the crowd without a microphone. "Every person here has a story. Every person here has felt the fear when those lights flash in their rearview mirror. But Ms. Rosa's story is different, not because what happened to her was worse, but because this time, we have proof they can't ignore." The crowd murmured in agreement. Parents held their children closer. Elderly community members dabbed at their eyes. Young men and women filmed everything on their phones, ensuring every word would reach beyond these walls. Officer Roberts didn't just assault an elderly woman, Aisha continued, her voice growing stronger. He exposed a system that's been protecting officers like him for years. Today, we received confirmation of 15 new complaints filed against the department. 15 stories that were buried until now. In the back of the room, Laura Roberts stood unrecognized, wearing sunglasses despite the evening hour. Each word hit her like a physical blow. These weren't just statistics or complaints anymore, these were real people, real pain, real lives affected by her husband's actions and the department's protection. The vigil transformed into a march. Hundreds of flameless candles moved through the streets, their holders singing hymns and civil rights anthems. News helicopters circled overhead, capturing the scene as the procession passed by the police station. Inside his home, Steve watched the coverage on TV, his face ashen. His daughter Emily had locked herself in her room, refusing to speak to him. The house felt empty without Laura. He grabbed his phone, dialing her number for the 20th time. "Stop calling." Laura's voice was cold when she finally answered. "I'm at the vigil, Steve. I'm listening to what these people have been trying to tell us for years. How could you? How could we ignore this for so long?" "You don't understand," Steve started, but Laura cut him off. "No, you don't understand. Mrs. Peterson from my book club. Her grandson was arrested by your partner last year. No charges filed, but he spent 3 days in jail. The Wilson kids I tutor. They take the long way to school because they're afraid of police harassment. I'm done pretending this isn't happening. The protests grew larger over the next 3 days. What started as a local movement began attracting national attention. Civil rights leaders arrived in town. Social media exploded with #JusticeForRosa hashtags and video clips of other incidents. At the emergency city council meeting, citizens lined up for hours to speak. Rosa sat quietly through it all, taking notes. When it was her turn to address the council, she rose slowly, aided by her cane. I have lived in this community for 40 years, she began, her voice quiet but firm. I've seen good officers and bad. But what I experienced was more than one bad officer. It was the result of a system that teaches fear instead of protection, force instead of service. The council chambers erupted in applause. Outside, the crowds grew larger. Protesters now included people from all parts of the city, all races, all ages. Signs demanded not just Steve's firing, but systemic change. The courthouse steps were crowded with media and protesters as Rosa Williams ascended them slowly, supported by her nephew Thomas. Her navy blue suit contrasted sharply with the white bandage still visible at her collar. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, but she maintained her dignified silence. Inside courtroom 302, Steve Roberts sat at the defense table, his police uniform replaced by a gray suit that seemed to hang loosely on his frame. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed sleepless nights. His union-appointed attorney shuffled papers nervously, aware that public opinion had already convicted his client. Judge Maria Hernandez entered, her reputation for fairness precisely why she'd been chosen for this high-profile case. This court will maintain order, she announced firmly, eyeing the packed gallery. Any disruptions will result in immediate removal. District Attorney Sarah Chin rose for her opening statement. This case is not just about one incident or one officer. The evidence will show a pattern of behavior, a system that enabled abuse, and a department that chose silence over justice. The first witness was the young boy Rosa had been helping across the street. 10-year-old Marcus Jefferson twisted his hands nervously as he spoke into the microphone. Ms. Rosa helps me cross that street every Tuesday, he testified. She was just holding my hand. Then the police officer started yelling and he paused, tears welling up. I was scared. Ms. Rosa never did anything wrong. Throughout the morning, a parade of witnesses took the stand. Store owners who had witnessed the incident. Residents who had filed previous complaints against Steve. Each testimony built upon the last, creating a damning picture. During the lunch recess, Laura sat alone in the courthouse cafeteria. She was scheduled to testify that afternoon, against her husband. Her hands shook as she tried to eat a sandwich. Steve's attorney had tried to block her testimony, citing marital privilege, but the judge had ruled that her evidence of departmental cover-ups was admissible. The afternoon session began with Officer Jenkins on the stand. His testimony about departmental practices drew gasps from the gallery. Yes, we were told to handle complaints in-house, he testified. That meant burying them. Officers who reported misconduct found themselves on graveyard shifts or directing traffic. Steve shifted uncomfortably in his chair as his former partner continued. Each word further eroded the wall of denial he'd built around himself. When Laura took the stand, she avoided looking at Steve. Her voice trembled at first but grew stronger as she described finding the hidden files, the emails, the pattern of abuse. I found documentation of 17 incidents in the past year alone, she testified. All involving excessive force against minority residents. All buried under bureaucratic paperwork. The defense attorney's cross-examination was aggressive. Mrs. Roberts, isn't it true that you're angry about your marital problems? That this testimony is revenge? Laura's spine straightened. I'm angry that I was complicit in a system that hurt people. I'm angry that I made excuses for abuse. And yes, I'm angry that my husband betrayed his oath to protect and serve. As the day ended, Rosa prepared for her testimony scheduled for tomorrow. In her hotel room, she reviewed her notes one final time. Her true identity as a federal agent remained sealed, that revelation would come later, at the right moment. Rosa's moment had arrived. As she took the witness stand, the courtroom fell into complete silence. Her years of training as a federal agent had prepared her for this moment, but nothing could fully prepare anyone for facing their attacker in court. "Please state your name for the record," the prosecutor began. "Rosa Williams," she paused, then continued, "badge number 8742, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Special Division for Law Enforcement Oversight." The courtroom erupted. Steve Roberts' face drained of color. His attorney jumped to his feet, demanding a mistrial. Judge Hernandez banged her gavel repeatedly until order was restored. "Your Honor," Rosa continued calmly, "for the past 5 years, I've been conducting an authorized federal investigation into systemic abuse within this police department. The incident with Officer Roberts was not isolated, it was the culmination of years of documented abuse." She pulled out a thick folder and began methodically laying out evidence. Reports of excessive force dating back a decade. Internal memos showing systematic suppression of complaints. Financial records revealing suspicious patterns of overtime pay used to reward officers who played along. "We identified 47 officers involved in covering up misconduct," Rosa testified. 15 superior officers who actively participated in burying complaints. And a pattern of retribution against any officer who tried to report abuse. In the gallery, Captain Morris sat rigid, his face a mask of controlled panic. His phone buzzed silently. Federal agents were currently executing search warrants at the station and his home. During cross-examination, Steve's attorney tried to discredit Rosa's testimony. "Why didn't you identify yourself during the incident?" "Because Officer Roberts never gave me the chance," Rosa replied evenly. "He was too busy assaulting me to hear my attempts to speak." That reaction, that immediate resort to violence, is exactly what our investigation was about. During the afternoon break, the courthouse steps became a media circus as news of Rosa's true identity spread. Aisha Johnson organized an impromptu press conference. "This isn't just about police brutality anymore," she declared to the cameras. "This is about a systematic effort to hide the truth. How many other Rosa Williamses are out there? How many other victims haven't had a federal badge to protect them?" Inside his office, the mayor watched the coverage with growing horror. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters, community leaders, the governor's office. The scandal was growing beyond containment. Back in the courtroom, Rosa's testimony continued. She described how the department manipulated crime statistics to justify increased patrols in minority neighborhoods. How officers who reported misconduct found themselves responding to dangerous calls without backup. How civilian complaints disappeared into administrative black holes. "The day Officer Roberts assaulted me," Rosa concluded, "he didn't just attack an elderly woman. He exposed a culture of violence and cover-ups that has terrorized this community for years." Steve Roberts sat slumped in his chair, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what he'd been part of. His certainties were crumbling, replaced by uncomfortable truths he'd spent years ignoring. The trial entered its crucial phase as Steve Roberts' defense attorney, James Mitchell, rose for his final attempt to discredit Rosa Williams. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, with every seat filled and reporters sketching furiously on their notepads. "Agent Williams," Mitchell's voice dripped with calculated skepticism, "isn't it true that your undercover operation was failing to produce results until this convenient incident?" Rosa remained composed, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "No, sir. We had already compiled substantial evidence. Your client's actions simply provided irrefutable proof of what we'd documented for years." Mitchell paced before the witness stand. "So you're saying you deliberately provoked my client? Set him up for this very public fall?" "Objection, Your Honor." The prosecutor jumped to her feet. "Counsel is attempting to victim blame a federal agent who was assaulted in broad daylight." Sustained, Judge Hernandez's voice cut through the tension. Her expression had grown increasingly troubled throughout the proceedings. In the gallery, Laura Roberts watched her husband's face. For the first time, she saw cracks in his armor of self-righteousness. Steve's shoulders hunched forward as each of his assumptions about the day crumbled under Rosa's testimony. Mitchell tried another angle. Agent Williams, how can we trust your testimony when you've admitted to lying about your identity for 5 years? Rosa leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. Officer Roberts didn't assault me because of my identity, counselor. He assaulted me because of my appearance, an elderly black woman in what he considered the wrong neighborhood. My badge doesn't make his actions more or less wrong. It just means I had the resources to fight back. The gallery erupted in murmurs of agreement. Judge Hernandez didn't bang her gavel this time, letting the weight of Rosa's words sink in. Steve Roberts suddenly stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I want to speak, he announced, his voice shaking. I need to speak. His attorney grabbed his arm, whispering furiously, but Steve shook him off. Your Honor, please. I need to say something. Judge Hernandez studied him carefully. Mr. Roberts, I must advise you that anything you say can be used against you. Do you understand this? I do, Your Honor. I understand it now more than ever. The judge nodded slowly. Very well. Proceed. Steve walked to the front of the courtroom, ignoring his attorney's attempts to stop him. He turned to face Rosa directly, his facade finally cracking completely. I was wrong, his voice broke. Not just that day. Every day. Every time I told myself I was just doing my job. Every time I ignored the fear in people's eyes. Every time I justified violence with procedure. He paused, swallowing hard. I became exactly what I claimed to be protecting people from. The courtroom fell silent. Even the reporters stopped writing, all eyes fixed on this unexpected moment of truth. The verdict came down like a thunderbolt, guilty on all counts. Judge Hernandez's voice echoed through the silent courtroom as she read out each charge: assault, excessive force, abuse of authority, civil rights violations. Steve Roberts stood motionless, his face pale but composed as he listened to the details of his sentence: 5 years in prison, permanent revocation of his law enforcement certification, and mandatory participation in a restorative justice program. Outside the courthouse, the crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. Cheers erupted from the hundreds gathered on the steps, their "Justice for Rosa" signs waving triumphantly in the air. Aisha Johnson, tears streaming down her face, hugged Rosa tightly. This isn't just your victory, Rosa told the gathered crowd, her voice carried by dozens of microphones. This is for every person who was ever afraid to speak up. Every person who wasn't believed. Every person who lost hope in the system. National news networks broke into regular programming to cover the verdict. Headlines flashed across screens across the country: corrupt cop convicted, federal agent exposes police corruption, landmark verdict signals change in police accountability. Laura Roberts watched the coverage from her sister's house, Emily beside her. Their lives had been completely upended, but Laura felt an unexpected sense of peace. Mom, Emily said quietly, do you think Dad really meant what he said in court? I think, Laura answered carefully, your father finally saw the truth he'd been running from for years. Sometimes it takes losing everything to see what really matters. The ripple effects spread quickly through the department. Captain Morris resigned before he could be fired, and Internal Affairs launched investigations into dozens of officers implicated in Rosa's testimony. The mayor announced the formation of a civilian oversight committee, with Aisha Johnson named as one of its inaugural members. Rosa's story became a national sensation. News programs featured her photograph alongside headlines about police reform. Civil rights organizations invited her to speak at conferences. Her phone rang constantly with interview requests from major networks. But it was in the quiet moments that the real impact became clear. At the community center where she'd volunteered for years, people began sharing their own stories. An elderly man described how he'd been afraid to walk in his own neighborhood. A young mother talked about teaching her children to fear those who should protect them. Ms. Rosa, a young boy, approached her after one community meeting. I want to be a police officer when I grow up. But I want to be the good kind, like you. Thomas Williams, Rosa's nephew, found himself overwhelmed with cases as more people came forward. It's like a dam broke, he told Rosa over dinner. People finally believe they'll be heard. the police department underwent a dramatic transformation. New leadership was appointed, with a mandate for comprehensive reform. Body camera policies were strengthened, de-escalation training became mandatory, and community engagement programs were expanded. Even Steve's former colleagues had to confront their own complicity. Officer Jenkins, who had testified against the department, was promoted to lead a new internal accountability unit. "We can't change the past," he told his team, "but we can damn well make sure it doesn't repeat itself." 6 months into his sentence, Steve Roberts sat in the prison's visitation room, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the business suit Rosa Williams wore. This meeting, arranged through their respective attorneys, marked a pivotal moment in both their lives. "Why did you want to see me?" Steve asked, his voice lacking its former arrogance. The months of incarceration had changed him. He looked older, more subdued, his shoulders carrying the weight of his actions. Rosa placed a thick folder on the table between them. "Because it's time you understood the full scope of what you were part of." She opened the folder, revealing photographs, statements, and reports. "These are the stories that never made it to court. The lives affected by the system you helped maintain." Steve's hands trembled as he looked through the documents. Each page revealed another incident, another victim, another story of injustice. His own name appeared repeatedly in the reports, alongside those of his former colleagues. "I was so sure I was right," he whispered, more to himself than to Rosa. "Every time I put on that uniform, I told myself I was protecting people. But I was just." His voice trailed off. "Creating fear," Rosa finished for him. "That's what happens when power goes unchecked. When authority becomes more important than humanity." In his office across town, Captain Morris cleared out his desk, his resignation letter still fresh on the mayor's desk. As he packed away his medals and commendations, a young officer appeared in his doorway, one of the new recruits hired under the department's reformed policies. "Sir," the officer said, "the federal investigators are here. They have more questions about the evidence suppression cases." Morris slumped in his chair, the fight finally gone from him. "Tell them I'm ready to talk. About everything." Meanwhile, at the community center, Aisha led the first meeting of the new Civilian Oversight Committee. The room was packed with residents, former officers, and city officials. Laura Roberts sat in the back, taking notes for her new role as a community liaison. "We're not here to point fingers," Aisha announced. "We're here to build something new. Something that serves everyone in this community, regardless of their race, their neighborhood, or their past." Back in the prison visiting room, Rosa pulled out one final document. "This is a proposal for a new police reform program. We want officers who've been through the system to help teach others where it went wrong. Would you be willing to participate when you're released?" Steve stared at the document for a long moment. "Why would you trust me with something like this? After what I did?" "Because change has to start somewhere," Rosa replied. "And sometimes, the best advocates for reform are those who've seen the problem from the inside." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the window, they could see news vans arriving. The story was breaking. Captain Morris had begun cooperating with federal investigators, revealing years of systematic corruption that went far beyond their department. "It's all coming down," Steve said quietly. "Everything we built. Everything we protected." "No," Rosa corrected him. "Everything you destroyed is being rebuilt. The question is, are you ready to help with that reconstruction?" 1 year later, Rosa Williams stood at a podium in the National Police Reform Conference, her cane now more of a symbol than a necessity. The audience before her included law enforcement officials, community leaders, and reform advocates from across the country. "Change," she began, "doesn't come from one verdict or one exposed scandal. It comes from the courage to keep pushing forward when the cameras leave and the headlines fade." In the audience, Steve Roberts sat in civilian clothes, his prison time served and his new purpose clear in his attentive posture. He was scheduled to speak later, part of a panel on police accountability and reform. His presence was controversial, but Rosa had insisted on his participation. During a break in the conference, Steve received an envelope from a former colleague. Inside was a detailed confession of years of misconduct, implicating dozens of officers across multiple departments. The note attached read simply, "You opened our eyes. Now help us make it right." Meanwhile, back in their city, Aisha Johnson led a graduation ceremony for the first class of officers trained under the new community-based police program. Laura Roberts, now heading the department's Family Outreach Division, watched proudly as the diverse group of recruits took their oaths. "Your badge," Aisha told them, "is not a shield from accountability. It's a symbol of your commitment to this community." Rosa's phone buzzed with an urgent message. The Justice Department was opening investigations into 5 more police departments based on evidence gathered during her original operation. Her testimony would be needed again, but this time, she wouldn't be alone. After the conference, Rosa and Steve sat in a quiet cafe. The awkwardness between them had evolved into a strange kind of professional respect. "I received an invitation to testify in the Oakland case," Steve said, stirring his coffee. "They want me to explain how the system corrupts from the inside." Rosa nodded. "Are you ready for that?" "No," he admitted. "But I wasn't ready to face what I'd done either. Sometimes being ready isn't as important as being willing." That evening, at a community celebration marking the anniversary of the verdict, Rosa watched as former adversaries worked together. Officer Jenkins, now a reformed trainer, chatted with Thomas about new accountability measures. Emily Roberts volunteered at the youth outreach booth, helping kids understand their rights and responsibilities. The mayor approached Rosa with news. The city council had unanimously approved funding for a national police reform training center, with Rosa as its director and Steve as a program consultant. "It's not revenge we're after," Rosa told the gathered crowd in her closing speech. "It's rebirth. A complete transformation of how we think about justice, community, and protection. 1 year ago, we exposed corruption. Today, we're building something new from those ashes." As the sun set over the community center, Rosa watched Steve speaking with a group of young officers, his face earnest as he shared his journey from perpetrator to advocate. She thought about the long road that had brought them here, the pain, the revelations, the slow process of healing. The story wasn't over. There would be more departments to investigate, more systems to reform, more minds to change. But standing there, watching former enemies working together for real change, Rosa knew that sometimes justice comes not from punishment, but from transformation. Ready to get back to work, she asked Steve as the event wound down. He nodded, understanding that their shared mission had only just begun. "Ready as I'll ever be."